Imagine this. A royal guard bound by duty faces an impossible choice: risk the safety of the kingdom to save a lost child. What happens when he defies orders? His actions will change everything. Stay with us to see how this brave guard's decision unfolds. This is a story of compassion, loyalty, and unexpected consequences that you won't want to miss. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to comment below where you're watching from, and make sure to like and subscribe for more amazing content. The kingdom of Alaron had long been known for its peace and prosperity, but its true strength lay in the royal guard, a select group of warriors chosen not only for their skill with a blade, but also for their unwavering loyalty to the crown. These men and women were trained from a young age, dedicating their lives to protecting the kingdom's most precious assets: the king, the royal family, and the very heart of the realm itself. Their duty was clear: serve without question, protect without hesitation, and obey the orders of the king above all else. Among them stood Kale, a man whose reputation was etched into the history of the royal guard. A soldier of unmatched precision and discipline, Kale had served for nearly 2 decades, rising through the ranks with a stoic, unwavering demeanor. His uniform was always immaculate, his sword always sharp, and his posture always rigid, never faltering. His reputation as a man of few words had earned him respect, but also distance from others. He spoke only when necessary, and his answers were direct, often cold. He followed orders without hesitation, without deviation. And yet, there was something in his eyes, something soft, almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't look closely. A glimmer of empathy, a hint of compassion that many of his peers dismissed as weakness. In a world where loyalty to the crown often meant sacrificing personal feelings, Kale's quiet humanity set him apart, though he rarely let it show. He understood the gravity of his duty and knew that the kingdom depended on men like him to maintain order. But deep within, a part of him wondered if there was more to being a protector than just executing commands. Today was one of those days when the full weight of his duty would be on display. The kingdom of Alaron was celebrating the annual Festival of the Golden Sun, a day marked by grand feasts, vibrant parades, and joyous celebrations. The streets were alive with color as citizens from all corners of the kingdom gathered in the city center, hoping to catch a glimpse of their beloved king. It was a day of unparalleled revelry, where nobles, merchants, and commoners alike joined in the festivities, united by the simple joy of their shared heritage. At the heart of the celebration, the king himself would make his appearance, riding in a golden chariot pulled by magnificent white steeds, his regal attire shimmering in the sunlight. The royal guard, in full ceremonial armor, had been strategically placed throughout the city to ensure the king's safety. Kale, as one of the senior guards, had been assigned the most critical task: protecting the king directly during his procession through the crowd. His sharp eyes scanned the masses for any sign of a threat, and his hand rested on the hilt of his sword, ready to act at a moment's notice. This was no ordinary festival. It was an event of great political importance. The king had invited foreign dignitaries, and there were rumors of unrest in neighboring kingdoms. The potential for sabotage or assassination loomed, and every royal guard had been briefed on the gravity of the situation. For Kale, this was just another day of duty. He had seen these grand events before and knew exactly how to maintain order. But the crowd, the thick, swarming mass of people, was a constant distraction. The air buzzed with laughter and music, but also with the tension of too many people packed into too small a space. Kale's focus was sharp, his gaze darting from one face to another, calculating the movements of every individual. He was vigilant, aware of the slightest shift in the crowd, the faintest hint of a threat. There was no room for error, no space for distraction. The king's life depended on the royal guard's ability to remain alert and keep the chaos at bay. Yet, amid the sea of jubilant festival-goers, something went wrong. A mother's voice, strangled with panic, cut through the hum of the crowd. Kale's eyes flicked toward the sound, and in that instant, he saw the child. A small boy, no older than 5, wandered through the chaos, his face tear-streaked, his tiny hands reaching out in desperation. His cries were muffled by the noise of the festival, drowned out by the chatter of the people. The child was lost, alone in a sea of bodies, separated from his mother. Kale's instinct was to move, but his post was clear, and the king's safety was paramount. He had been trained to ignore everything else, anything that wasn't a direct threat to the crown. The guards around him were just as focused, just as rigid in their discipline. They couldn't afford to be distracted, not with the king's life at stake. But Kale couldn't tear his eyes away from the child. The boy's gaze met his for just a moment, and something in the child's face made Kale's heart tighten. The boy was lost. He was afraid. And no one, not a single soul in the crowded streets, seemed to notice. The festival continued, oblivious to the child's plight. The royal guard was supposed to be a symbol of strength, of order, but in this moment, Kale felt powerless. The king was safe, for now. But what about the child? What about the people they were meant to protect, the very people who had trusted them to be their shield, their guardians? As Kale stood at attention, torn between his duty to the king and his instinct to help the child, a fleeting thought crossed his mind. What kind of protector would he be if he couldn't help those who needed it the most? But he dismissed the thought. It was not his place to question orders. Not here. Not now. The mother's voice pierced through the noise of the crowd, trembling with raw panic that cut through the merrymaking of the festival. Her words were desperate, carried on the wind like a cry for help. "Has anyone seen my son? Please, someone, help me." She was a simple woman, her clothes plain and worn from years of hard work, but her eyes were wide, searching frantically through the throng of people. Her face was flushed with fear, her lips trembling as she pushed past festival goers, her hands reaching out, touching anyone she could in her desperation. Every second she couldn't find her son felt like an eternity, but no one seemed to notice her. The crowd was too caught up in their own excitement, laughing, dancing, singing, celebrating as though nothing else mattered. The guards, standing tall at their posts, barely spared a glance. Their focus was sharp, but not on her. It was on the king, on maintaining order, on preventing any threat that might disrupt the celebration. But the cries of a distraught mother, to them, it was just noise, a disturbance. The child's disappearance seemed insignificant, just another moment of confusion in a festival designed to distract them all from the world beyond. Among them was Kale, standing at the northern gates of the palace grounds, his gaze scanning the horizon, his posture as rigid as ever. He had seen this kind of thing before, people getting caught up in the frenzy of the festivities, losing track of their loved ones in the crowd. It wasn't unusual. But something about this felt different. The mother's voice was raw with emotion, and the fear in it dug deep into his chest. He could hear her now, louder and clearer than ever before, as she moved closer. "My boy, my son, where are you? Please, someone help me." Kale's heart skipped a beat. For a brief moment, his eyes flickered toward the sound, his body instinctively shifting as though drawn by an invisible force. He saw her, a small woman clutching a scarf to her chest, her eyes wild with panic. Her hands reached out as though she could somehow pull the crowd apart and find her child. But the people passed her by, oblivious to the mother's pain. Kale's fingers clenched around the hilt of his sword, his knuckles turning white as he fought to keep his composure. The duty he had sworn to uphold was clear: protect the king, guard the royal family. His post was crucial to the safety of the kingdom's most important figure, and any deviation from his orders could result in grave consequences, not just for him, but for the kingdom itself. He couldn't afford to leave his station, not when the king was making his way through the heart of the festival, surrounded by dignitaries and the ever-present risk of assassination. Yet in that moment, Kale's thoughts twisted and turned. The mother's frantic search haunted him, her desperate face flashing through his mind. Was he truly fulfilling his duty by staying here? Was protecting the king more important than protecting the very people he had sworn to defend? He had trained his whole life to safeguard the realm, but now, standing motionless in the face of real human suffering, his conviction seemed less certain. His duty had always been black and white, until now. The child, lost, alone, vulnerable, was someone's son, someone's heart. Kale imagined the fear in the boy's eyes, the terror of being surrounded by strangers in a sea of noise, with no one to comfort him. A sharp pang of guilt shot through Kale's chest. Could he truly stand by and let the mother's cries go unanswered? Could he be the one who idly followed orders while a simple act of compassion could make a difference? His eyes scanned the crowd again, searching for the mother, for the child. A deep unease gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake, a sense that something terrible was unfolding before him, and he was powerless to stop it. The orders were clear. Stay at your post. Protect the king. Do not leave unless absolutely necessary. But how could he stand there, motionless, while a mother lost her child in the very streets he was sworn to protect? The words echoed in his mind. Do not leave your post. It was an order, an unspoken rule, one he had lived by for years. It was the foundation of his loyalty to the crown. But the more he thought about it, the more distant those words seemed. He could still protect the king from here, couldn't he? His eyes were sharp, his mind alert, his hand steady on his sword. But the child, the boy, would remain lost, alone if no one intervened. Cale's heart twisted with indecision. His fingers twitched at his side, but he remained where he was, his feet cemented to the ground. He had trained for years to block out distractions, to focus only on his duty. Yet now the mother's voice rang in his ears, louder than any royal order, louder than the demands of duty. It reached into him, pulling him toward something deeper, something more personal. But as Cale's gaze shifted toward the mother again, he saw her stumbling, her tears mingling with the dust of the crowded streets. She collapsed onto her knees, the weight of her grief too much to bear. Cale could feel it, the helplessness washing over her, the despair threatening to consume her. For a moment the world seemed to slow around him. The king, the guards, the festival, all of it faded into the background, swallowed by the realization that something was more important than orders. The kingdom's duty to its people was not just about protecting the crown. It was about protecting those who lived within it, who loved it, who believed in it. The king's life was important, yes, but so was this child's. So was this mother's. And for the first time in his career, Cale had to make a choice. Cale's posture remained rigid, his eyes sharp and focused as Captain Alaric approached with a deliberate stride. The captain's presence was commanding, his armor gleaming in the sunlight, a reminder of the authority he wielded over the royal guard. Cale, Captain Alaric said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the haze of the festival's music and laughter. You've been reassigned. The northern gate needs securing immediately. You're to leave your post at the king's side and take command of that position. No distractions, no excuses. If anything happens to the king, if there is even a whisper of danger, it will be your responsibility. Cale stood at attention, his body moving with the precision of years of training, but his mind was elsewhere. The words stung in ways he couldn't explain. The king's safety was paramount, yes, but Cale's thoughts were filled with the mother's cries, the image of her frantically searching, the desperation in her eyes. He could still hear her voice echoing in his ears, the haunting plea of a mother who had lost everything in the midst of a celebration. He clenched his fists, the metal of his gauntlets biting into his palms. The conflict inside him was a storm, each passing second, heightening his sense of inner turmoil. He had served loyally for many years, obeying orders without hesitation. He had always believed that his duty was clear, that his purpose was to protect the king, the crown, the kingdom. But what if it were his own child lost in that crowd? The thought hit him like a wave. His breath caught in his throat, and for a split second, he imagined the fear that would grip him if his own son, if he had one, were separated from him in such a way. What if Cale's own flesh and blood were somewhere out there, crying for him in the midst of the chaos, lost and afraid, while no one took the time to listen? Wouldn't he want someone, anyone, to act, to stand up, to ensure his child was safe, even if it meant breaking the rules? His mind raced with the question, torn between two forces. On one side was the unshakable duty he had sworn to uphold, a duty to protect, to serve the king, to follow orders without hesitation. He had been taught that a soldier's life was bound by discipline and structure. There could be no room for deviation. If he faltered now, even for a moment, there would be consequences. The entire system was built on unwavering loyalty to the crown. But on the other side was a quiet voice, one that had always been there, but that he had rarely listened to, the voice of his own humanity. The voice that questioned whether his role as a protector was greater than his role as a soldier. If he could only be so steadfast in following orders, what did that say about his ability to care for those who needed him most? What did it mean if he chose to stand by and watch a child be forgotten in the crowd? Cale's eyes flickered to the distant royal procession. The king's chariot moved steadily through the streets, flanked by guards, surrounded by the opulence of the ceremony. But in the sea of celebration, Cale could not help but see beyond the gilded cage, the cries of the mother, the trembling hands of a child in need. He wanted to look away. He wanted to silence the questions that echoed in his mind. But the truth remained. He could not. The orders, the royal orders, rang clearly in his ears like a drumbeat in the distance. He had been trained for this. He had sacrificed everything for this moment. His life was devoted to the service of the king, to the safety of the crown. And yet the mother's voice haunted him like a shadow. She was someone's mother. Someone's child was lost. For a moment, Cale felt paralyzed, his duty pulling him in one direction, his conscience in another. He felt as if he were standing on the edge of a precipice, unable to move forward without leaving something important behind. Captain Alaric stepped closer, his gaze narrowing slightly. "Cale," he said again, this time with more force. "I said, the northern gate, no excuses." Cale blinked, snapping out of his internal struggle. The captain's voice grounded him. His training kicked in, his sense of loyalty to the crown firing back into place. The king's safety came first. The orders were clear, but then Cale's mind returned to the question that had plagued him. What would he want if it were his own child? The weight of his thoughts pressed down on him, suffocating him in the tension between what he was supposed to do and what he felt was right. It was a painful, impossible choice, one that tested everything he believed in. Cale stood motionless for a moment, still wrestling with his inner turmoil. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he nodded sharply to Captain Alaric. "Understood, Captain." Alaric gave a curt nod and turned, walking away to oversee the rest of the guards. Cale remained where he stood, frozen for a moment longer as the weight of his decision crushed him. The northern gate, he thought again. His mission was clear, but something in his chest tightened. The duty that had once felt so simple was no longer enough. He had made his for now, but deep inside something had shifted. The battle within him was not over, and the quiet voice of compassion, the voice urging him to break from protocol, would not be silenced so easily. The weight of the child's plight bore down on Cale like an unbearable stone. His heart ached as he thought of the frightened little boy, lost and alone in a sea of strangers. How could he simply stand by and pretend nothing was wrong when a life, however small, was hanging in the balance? The orders were clear: protect the king. But what was his true purpose as a protector? To follow orders blindly or to serve those who needed him most? Cale's resolve hardened. The king's safety was paramount, yes, but what kind of protector would he be if he ignored the cries of a helpless child? What if the people, the kingdom's people, felt abandoned by the very guards sworn to defend them? In that moment, Cale knew what he had to do. Breaking protocol with a swift motion, Cale turned on his heel, his footsteps muffled by the sounds of the bustling festival. He glanced over his shoulder one last time to ensure none of his fellow guards were watching, his heart racing as the weight of his decision sank in. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The air felt thick with tension. But the child, the mother, and the cries of desperation cut through the stillness, urging him forward. Without a second thought, Cale stepped away from his post, blending into the crowd. His armor gleamed in the sunlight, but he moved with practiced grace, careful not to draw attention. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning every face in the throng. The sea of people was overwhelming. Dancers spun in intricate patterns, musicians played lively tunes, and the air was alive with joy. But amidst the celebrations, Cale's mind remained singularly focused. He couldn't afford to be distracted. Not now. Not when a child needed him. He heard it before he saw him. The faint sobs, the soft, heart-wrenching sound of a child crying in fear. It was the sound of desperation, a plea for help. Cale's heart quickened as he followed the noise, pushing past groups of festival-goers, his gaze narrowing as he searched for any sign of the boy. And then, behind a cart laden with brightly colored fabrics, Cale spotted him, a small boy, hunched over, his tiny body trembling, his face streaked with tears. His delicate hands wiped at his eyes, but the sadness remained, etched deep into his features. He was a picture of lost innocence, a child who should have been laughing with his mother, not hiding in fear. Kale's breath caught in his throat, but he didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his large frame looming over the child. For a brief moment, the boy looked up, startled by the sight of the imposing guard. His eyes widened in fear, but Kale's voice was calm and gentle, like the soothing whisper of a promise. "It's all right, little one," Kale said softly, crouching down so he was at eye level with the boy. "I'm here to help. We'll find your mother." The boy's eyes searched Kale's face, confusion and hope battling for dominance. He was still trembling, his small shoulders shaking with sobs, but something in Kale's voice, something in the warmth of his gaze, seemed to comfort him. Slowly, the child stopped crying, his sobs quieting into sniffles as Kale extended a hand. Kale's heart swelled with relief, a deep sense of peace settling over him as he took the boy's tiny hand in his own. The warmth of the child's small fingers wrapped around his much larger ones was a quiet reminder that he had made the right choice. "We'll get you back to your mother," Kale assured him, his voice steady with conviction. "Just stay close." As Kale stood and guided the boy through the crowd, he couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose, something far deeper than duty or orders. The chaos of the festival swirled around them, laughter, music, dancing, but Kale's focus remained on the child. Every step he took, every movement, was driven by the promise he had made, to protect the boy, to bring him back to the one person who cared for him above all else. The festival, which had once seemed so distant and insignificant in the grand scheme of things, had become a maze of distractions. Kale's eyes never left the child, his every instinct attuned to the boy's every move. They passed through clusters of dancers, musicians, and market stalls, weaving in and out of the thickening crowd. Time was running short. Kale could feel it, a gnawing urgency, a weight in the pit of his stomach. Every second he spent searching was another moment the king's safety could be compromised. But he could not, would not turn back now. With each step, Kale thought of the king, his fellow guards, and his duty. But the thought of a lost child, alone in the world, outweighed it all. He had sworn to protect, and he would do so, no matter what. "Almost there, little one," Kale murmured, his voice steady even as his heart raced. The boy's small fingers tightened around his hand, and Kale gave a reassuring smile, though inside, a storm was brewing. Every second was a race, against time, against his own doubt, against the ticking clock that told him he was betraying his orders. But as long as the child was with him, Kale knew he was doing the only thing that truly mattered. For the first time in years, he had made a choice that felt right. The sounds of the festival swirled around Kale as he continued to navigate through the crowd, his hands still gently holding the boy's. His heart pounded with every step, but a newfound sense of purpose steadied him. He couldn't stop moving. He couldn't stop until he had kept his promise. The boy's small fingers tightened in his grasp, the tiny hand offering an unexpected comfort, as if it were Kale who needed reassurance. It was as though the child understood that this moment was just as important for the towering guard as it was for him. And then, through the crowd, Kale spotted her, the mother. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, her eyes wild with a desperation that mirrored the depth of Kale's own concerns. She was still searching, frantic, her every movement a reflection of the agony only a mother could feel in such a moment. She was just as lost in the crowd as her child had been. And then their eyes met. It was as though the world had paused. The mother's frantic gaze locked onto her son, who stood before her now, slightly bruised but safe. Her lips parted in shock, and for a brief moment, silence stretched between them. Then, as if the entire weight of her anxiety melted away in an instant, a joyful cry broke from her chest. "My boy!" she exclaimed, her voice trembling with relief. Without a moment's hesitation, she rushed toward him, her arms opening wide to envelop him. The boy let out a soft sob, his small arms flinging around his mother's neck as she scooped him up in an embrace so tight it was as if she feared losing him again. The child, who had been trembling only moments ago, now clung to her like a lifeline, his tears mingling with hers. Kale stepped back, allowing the reunion to unfold before him. For a moment, the noise of the crowd seemed to fade, The laughter, the music, the clattering of the festival, all drowned out by the sheer beauty of the moment. It was just a mother and her child, reunited after an agonizing separation. In that space, there was no formality, no rank, no expectations. There was only love, raw and unfiltered. Cale stood at a distance, watching them, feeling a strange peace wash over him. He had never expected a reward for his actions, not in the way he had come to know them during his service as a guard. No medals, no accolades, no praise from the king. Those things had always been distant and abstract to him. But this moment, this was real. This was the kind of reward he had never anticipated. The quiet, humbling fulfillment of seeing two lives, once torn apart, now whole again. As the mother pressed a kiss to her son's forehead, her eyes found Cale's, and she gave him a look too full of gratitude to put into words. The tears in her eyes spoke volumes, a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming thankfulness that she could finally hold her child again. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing him back." Cale nodded, his throat tight, unsure of what to say in response. He had no words for this kind of gratitude. It was not the thanks of royalty, not the stiff formality of a king's court. It was raw, simple, human, and it touched him deeper than any honor he had ever been given. The child, still clinging to his mother, looked up at Cale with wide, innocent eyes. A small smile curled at the corner of the boy's lips, and Cale's heart swelled with something he had not expected to feel. A warmth, a quiet joy that came from knowing he had made a difference. The boy's mother adjusted him in her arms, her eyes now filled with a gentle smile, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift. The chaos of the festival, the tension of royal duties, and the lingering sense of defiance faded into the background. In that moment, Cale knew he had done the right thing. This was why he served, not for grand ceremonies or high positions, but for these quiet moments of human connection. To protect people, not just the king, but every life in the kingdom. This feeling of doing something truly meaningful was a reward he would carry with him forever. As he turned to leave, his duty pulling him back to his post, Cale felt something stir within him, a deep sense of fulfillment, not from his title or his armor, but from the simple act of kindness. He had followed his heart, even when the world around him demanded obedience without question. And for that, he would never regret his decision. As Cale walked away from the reunited mother and child, a sense of peace washed over him. He had done what felt right in his heart, but with every step back toward his post, the reality of the consequences loomed large. The sounds of the festival faded, and the once celebratory atmosphere turned into a heavy, suffocating silence in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just defied the very essence of his training, his duty. And then, just as he reached the edge of the crowd, he saw him, Captain Alaric. The captain's stern face was set in an unyielding expression, his arms crossed as he stood at a distance, watching Cale approach. When their eyes met, Cale's stomach tightened. He had been expecting this confrontation, and now it was here. "You disobeyed direct orders," Captain Alaric said, his voice low but filled with undeniable authority. The words hung in the air like a weight Cale couldn't shake. "You left your post. You risked the kingdom's safety." Cale stood tall, meeting his superior's gaze with unwavering resolve. His posture was rigid, but his voice was steady, calm, sure. "I did what was right," he replied. "Sometimes, protecting the kingdom means protecting its people, every one of them." The captain's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression unreadable as he took a step closer. The silence between them thickened, like a storm about to break. Cale felt the pressure of the moment, but he refused to look away. His heart pounded in his chest, the decision he had made still fresh in his mind, but he had no regrets. Time seemed to stretch, and just as Cale began to feel the weight of his actions, the captain finally broke the silence. "Your actions were reckless," Alaric admitted, his voice softer now. "But they were also necessary. We don't always see the people we protect, but today, you reminded us why we do this." Cale's breath caught, and for the first time a sense of relief slowly spread through him. The captain wasn't angry, not in the way Cale had feared. It wasn't approval either, but something more, understanding. The kingdom's safety and its people were not so easily separated. Alaric had seen what Cale had done, and in some unspoken way, he understood its significance. You've made your point, Alaric continued, his voice quiet but resolute. But be mindful, Kale. Never forget the weight of the choices you make. He turned then, his tone shifting. The king's orders are not to be taken lightly. With that, the captain walked away, leaving Kale standing alone, but no longer burdened by guilt or uncertainty. The days that followed were quiet, the celebrations of the Festival of the Golden Sun fading into the rhythms of daily life. Kale returned to his post, standing once again at the palace gates, but something had shifted. The weight of his duty felt different now, not lighter, but more profound. He was no longer just a guard following orders. He was a protector who understood the true meaning of his role. The king had heard of Kale's actions, and though the guard had not been punished, he had been called to the royal court. Recognizing Kale's bravery and compassion, the king granted him a special commendation, an honor small in comparison to the title and rank of other guards, but one that held immeasurable weight for Kale. The king had seen the value of what Kale had done, and in his eyes, the royal guard was more than just a symbol of strength. It was a symbol of care for the kingdom's people. The people of the kingdom, too, began to view the royal guard in a new light, not just as an unyielding force of warriors, but as protectors who truly cared for their welfare. News of Kale's actions spread, whispered in the streets and markets, in homes and taverns. In the eyes of the kingdom's citizens, he had become something more than a soldier, a hero, a protector who valued the lives of the people he had sworn to defend, not just the throne. Kale stood silently at his post, gazing out over the kingdom. His armor glinted in the sunlight, but it was no longer merely a symbol of authority. It was a reminder of the choice he had made that day, the choice to protect, to serve, to act with compassion. He knew now that his duty was not just about following orders. It was about doing what was right when the time came, even if it meant defying the very orders he had sworn to uphold. The king ruled the land, but it was the people's lives that mattered most. In every corner of the kingdom, Kale now understood. It was the people, mothers, fathers, children, the vulnerable, who were the heart of the realm. And it was their lives that made the kingdom strong. The boy and his mother, forever touched by Kale's bravery, would never forget the quiet hero who had risked everything to reunite them. And though Kale had returned to his post as a guard, a part of him would always carry that quiet legacy, knowing that his actions, small as they seemed, had made a world of difference. And in the quiet moments, when Kale stood alone in the cool dusk, watching over the kingdom, he would remember that even the smallest acts of kindness could change the course of a life. His duty would never be the same again.